إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوكل عليه والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Indeed, all praise is due to Allah. We thank Him, we praise Him, we turn to Him, trust in Him. Particularly in these times, we turn to Him. I've just heard of so many people passing away these past few days. SubhanAllah, we just turn to Allah, ask for Him to envelope us in His mercy and His protection in this time. And peace and blessings be upon Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this beacon of light, this gentle soul, this wonderful being, this mercy to the worlds, this inspiration, this personality who set us a path that brings us hope, and it brings us a way to connect with our Creator and inshallah to benefit from eternal life and the company of the Salihin, inshallah, and being people of the right hand. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam showed us a way. He showed us a way to live, a way to be better people, and it's a way that we follow the best of. And there are times when you find things that maybe confuse you, but our approach as believers is that we know that the religion is a way of mercy. We know it is a light, and so where we feel that light, of course we follow. Where we feel things that are confusing, we look for clarification, right? And in some ways, this whole series has been about that. Slavery is something that makes you feel very uncomfortable. I hope should do. Makes us all feel uncomfortable. And the whole idea with this series has been to try and make sense of the complex history around slavery, the complex practice of slavery as well, and also try to understand what the approach of Islam was to slavery, and also what our approach should be today and what lessons we can learn. That's going to be particularly important. So moving to the session today, our idea is going to be to go over a quick recap of what we've done so far, but bringing it into the context of the end of slavery, because that's really what we're about in today's presentation. So we're going to go through slavery in Christendom, the abolition movement, which is primarily the British abolition movement, and its relevance, not because we're living in Britain alone, because it actually had a significant impact. We'll come into that. So then we'll move on to the abolition movement or process in the Muslim world, and that was quite dramatic. And then look at how fiqh kind of followed suit. It didn't lead, it followed suit with abolition, and how scholars reconciled themselves to the idea of abolition, because that wasn't there originally. And then we'll just conclude with what the lessons are for today. Okay. Recap then. So remember last time we talked about the slave trade, and we talked about the kind of absolute horrors of the process of people becoming slaves. We looked at the Vikings, and we looked at the surprising fact that the Vikings traded primarily with Byzantium and the Muslim world, the two main trading partners. And the commodity that the Vikings primarily traded in was slaves, shockingly. We looked at Zanzibar. This is a picture of a dhow which was intercepted by the British Navy, and it was on the way to Zanzibar, taking slaves with it. And just look at the terrible state of these potential slaves. Well, they were slaves; they'd already been enslaved. They had probably been free people who had been raided, harmless, normal, innocent people going about their daily business, and suddenly raiders came upon them, snatched them away, killed, pillaged, and then took the people they wanted as slaves. Look at them, they're mostly children. And we went through stories of Zanzibar, how, when kind of cholera struck, the slaves were ill, stricken, starved, weak, and of so little value that they were being thrown overboard because by the time they brought them to port, they'd have to pay a $2 tax on each slave, and they didn't feel that the slaves were worth it. Subhanallah. We looked at the kind of raiding that took place by the Corsairs and also by the Turkish Navy as well, and how, you know, whole villages were enslaved and taken away. The entire population of Gozo, which is basically Malta's made up of 2 islands, and one of the islands, Gozo, taken away entirely as slaves by the Turkish Navy, the Ottoman Navy. And we looked at Iberia, Spain, how, you know, actually when most of Europe had given up slavery, Spain still had lots of slaves, and they were Muslim slaves. And their approach towards capturing Muslim slaves when they captured a city or taking them was actually very similar to what Muslims had been doing to them. Basically, they were mirroring, that's all. And, you know, the entire population of Menorca was taken as slaves, Almira, etc., etc. So this was the terrible situation of the slave trade. But we've also looked at how the ethics of Islam are not compatible with slave trading, with raiding, making slaves, just not compatible. We've looked at the sublime spiritual code. You look at the teachings of the spiritual code, and what do you see? You see that, you know, wow, actually it's all about morality. It's about the highest standards, and it's inspiring to any human being, because that's what we all want to aspire to. If we look at the teachings regarding service, we see that, you know, one of the key teachings that if you want to be Ashabul Mayman, the people of the right hand, then you do fakku raqaba, which is freeing slaves, freeing the enslaved. Yeah, and also tawasaw bil marhama, encouraging people to have this sense of pity, of compassion, of empathy in the hearts towards people who are suffering. Right? We've looked at teachings of the Quran. If you look at these verses, for instance, they talk about being non-aggressive, right? If people incline towards peace, you incline towards peace. There's amazing verse here, which literally, I mean, these verses are telling you that raiding is wrong. It's fundamentally against the values, the ethics of the Quran. Okay, it's this verse, for instance, it says that, you know, for people that aren't fighting against you or turning you out of your homes, then God isn't forbidding you from being kind to them and being just to them. And indeed, God loves those who act justly. Yeah, so this is the fundamental ethic. We know that the Quran condemns Pharaoh because he transgressed all bounds. You know, the Prophet ﷺ says that when you do have responsibilities, for instance, you have slaves, then they are your guardians over them. The ethic is that, you know, leadership is not about tyranny. Leadership is responsibility. Yeah, that's the ethic of the Quran. I thought we saw the example of the Prophet ﷺ, how, you know, I can't go into all the details that we did that last time, but the Prophet ﷺ was, you know, he redefined, he wanted to basically completely reframe the idea of slavery. That slavery, you know, if there was a legal status of a slave, that they're actually your brother. Treat them like your brother, give them your clothes, feed them your food. If you're burdening them, then ease the burden by helping them yourself, right? Etc. That you treat them like your members of your family, you know, like your own children. And then, of course, the ethic of freeing slaves, free, to the point that we made the argument that even if the law didn't say so, the ethic that the Quran was emphasizing is that the purpose of the religion is to encourage everyone to free their slaves, right? So that's an argument in itself, that that's what Islam is meant to be about. But, you know, people do say, well, okay, I mean, quotes like this are a bit funny, okay? The person say, well, we know that God forbade explicitly music, wine, and sausages, but why did he not unambiguously forbid slavery? And we've looked at the context that the Prophet ﷺ would have loved to, but actually you could see that actually you could say that enslaving was forbidden by Islam, except when there was a necessity. So this basic principle in Sharia that necessity dictates exceptions. And the Prophet, when he did enslave, he didn't mostly enslave captive people, captive enemies. It's only when he felt like they were going to rebel again. And so out of necessity, he enslaved certain populations, often freed them again afterwards, you know? So to the point where, you know, Jonathan Brown, for instance, observes that the analogy of warfare and violence is apt. that the Quran sometimes allowed and commanded violence, but condemning its excesses, recognizing that it's often hated and unpalatable, but an alternative to strife, etc. Yeah. There's a scholar, Rashid Rida, who emphasized this argument, that he says that, is a scholar of the turn of the century, but a very leading intellectual thinker. So he said that far from being required or even recommended in and of itself, slavery in Islam was only allowed out of necessity because of how widespread it was at the time of Islam's coming. So, we see that basically slavery was so prevalent and it's so much a part of the economic system that you couldn't suddenly abolish it and turn kind of all the industry falls apart and suddenly you've got a mass of slaves who are unemployed, unsupported, etc. And that enslaving and warfare was out of actual necessity alone, right? There are quotes here, for instance, that show that the Prophet ﷺ was only able, was not always able to do things he wanted to do. Some people, another argument people have is that, well, why didn't God forbid? Why didn't God end it? But that's just not the way that religion works, right? And the Quran itself says that you cannot guide everyone you love to the truth. You might want it, O Prophet, but all the things that you want can't always happen, essentially. So there's a concept of trajectory hermeneutics. Trajectory hermeneutics is basically this idea, and came in Christianity, that you have a starting point in the law, and Christianity, it's the Old Testament, and then you get a kind of new teachings which don't quite end slavery, but they're pointing towards the ending of slavery. And we have the example of the pre-existing laws, which were already there before Islam, and Islam allowed them to continue. But then there was the ethic of the teachings of the Prophet about ending slavery and about treating slaves well. And then finally, you have the possibility of ending slavery. And if that occurs, then you should then go ahead and do it because it's pointing towards it. The problem, though, is that didn't happen. And the question is, what went wrong? We've looked at this already. What actually went wrong is that, first of all, there was this permissibility of slavery. Then, at the time of Umar, when those huge areas being captured, there's a mass of slaves that came into the Muslim world. And then people developed a culture of dependency on slaves. But crucially, Islam has such a strong emphasis on manumission that most of the slaves that came in were all freed. The problem then is that because there's a dependency now, so then there's a massive need for more slaves, and that resulted in the slave trade. And so there's much more, the slave trade actually magnified through Islam. And we know, that actually the law in many ways failed slaves because it didn't end the trade, because the trade largely was illegal, but the law essentially turned a blind eye to it. We covered that last week. The question is why? And just to end, the point is that Islamic law, as in the body of law that the scholars were practicing and writing about, was based upon a number of factors. It was based upon scholarly tradition, which came from the Quran and Sunnah, of course, but the Quran and Sunnah was also influenced by local customs. We covered that last time. And local customs shaped the laws that scholars were making, because it's urf is a fundamental source of Islamic law. So are governmental policies, but also governmental pressure. So scholars, if they stuck their neck out too far, could end up losing it. So there are lots of things that were constraining scholars from changing the law. Doesn't mean that they didn't speak out about the ethics. You see the difference between ethics and law, yeah. So anyway, that's the introduction. We'll now move on to Sara to talk about slavery in Christendom.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can I screen share, please? Thank you. Right. Here we go. Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So what I hope to do today is go through the history of slavery in Britain, just a snippet of that, and then look at serfdom versus slavery, then look at the Christian world and slavery, and then look at abolition. And there's some really fascinating characters that I wanted to talk about today. So I hope you find it as fascinating as I have looking into this topic. So starting with slavery in Great Britain from the 5th to the 13th century. So slavery in Great Britain existed before Roman times. Under the Roman Empire, slavery expanded. The Anglo-Saxons continued with practicing slavery, for example, selling Britons to the Irish. There are cases documented of fair-haired boys from York being seen in Rome. Slavery then took a downturn with William the Conqueror, so in Norman times, where he banned the export of slaves from England. So slavery wasn't banned in total, but the export of slaves from England was. And in 1102, the church issued decrees decrying slavery, but these were not legal edicts. So by around 1200, slavery in the British Isles had become virtually non-existent. The argument is, did it morph into serfdom? So I'm sure you've all heard of serfs, and the next slide is about serfs. So we said from the 5th century onwards, so now we have the 6th century, the fall of the Roman Empire, and slavery became less and less and less, but the institution of serfdom increased. Serfs emerged as a class of servile peasants. Serfs were tied through labor to the land that was given to them by the lord. And what happened was serfs were really at risk of being harmed by violent, ravaging tribes. So by being protected by a lord and working on the land, they had this kind of symbiotic relationship where they received protection, yet they worked the land. The land that they worked on would be the land that would provide their own food, and they would also look after themselves, provide for their own clothing, and would also earn from that work, but they would have to give a substantial amount of the harvest from that land to the landlord. The difference between serfs and slaves was that slaves were owned, serfs were not. Slaves owned no property, were often imported from other countries, and could be physically punished if they didn't do the work that was demanded from them. Serfs held plots of land as payment for their work. They worked part-time for themselves and part-time for the lord, and they could accumulate personal wealth. Their freedoms were limited. They lived in family units, unlike slaves, but their movement was limited. They couldn't marry. They couldn't move outside of that area without their landlord's permission. And they could be treated harshly with very little legal redress from the landlords. So those are the similarities and differences between serfs and slaves. So from the 5th to the 13th century, you get this increasing institution of serfdom, but with the Black Death, with so many of the population dying, you had a more favorable environment for serfs. So you had a lot of peasant revolts and more favorable conditions for them. We now come to medieval Europe, and I just wanted to talk about Venice, Genoa, and Amalfi as focuses in the slave trade. So demand from the Muslim world dominated the slave trade in medieval Europe. Muslim Spain was importing enormous numbers of slaves. If you look at this statistic here, during the reign of Abdurrahman III from 912 to 961, there were 13,750 Slavic slaves in Cordoba. So that's quite a huge number for one city. And because the church had banned selling Christian slaves to Muslims in 840, Venetians would sell Slavic, Eastern European, non-Christian slaves to Muslims in North Africa, Muslim Spain, and so on. So Venetian slave trade was really surpassing others, so was Genoa as well. And we've talked about eunuchs. So eunuchs were particularly valuable, particularly expensive. And castration houses were set up in Venice. So again, this element of harm was outsourced, really. It was far from the eyes of those who were buying the slaves, I suppose. Most Venetian families would have slaves. And here between 1414 and 1423, there were 10,000 slaves sold in Venice. So when we often go there as tourists, we forget this dark history, I think, of Venice, Genoa, and Amalfi. There are paintings of that time with black gondoliers who would almost certainly have been slaves. Marco Polo manumitted his slave before he died in 1324. So the policy of the church in the medieval period was to end the enslavement of free Christians and not to sell Christians to non-Christians, but the enslavement of non-Christians remained permissible. Pretty much like Rizwan was saying, it's a mirroring of what happened under Muslims as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about after, so we've moved on, we've moved to the 1300s. If we move on now, we see this overlap with slavery, colonization, and missionary zeal. So with the Reconquista, the Iberian Peninsula had the enslavement of Muslims and Jews. West Africa by Portugal, and America by Spain. Now here you get colonization, you get missionary work, and the institution of slavery, and these overlapping political influence going on, impetus, I suppose. There were papal bulls allowing colonization, Christianization, and enslavement. So it was effectively allowed by the papal laws. And there were clergy who were horrified by the methods of colonizers. You probably all read about, particularly in South America, the kind of horrific treatment of the natives there. Bartholomew de las Casas was horrified by some of the methods and wrote to the Pope about what was going on in terms of slavery and the treatment of slaves. But despite that, priests, nuns, and brotherhoods had large numbers of slaves. And because you weren't supposed to enslave the Christian, there was a Spanish legal proclamation called the Requerimiento, which was a proclamation to natives to accept Christianity. And if they didn't, they could then be enslaved because they hadn't accepted it. If they accepted Christianity, they couldn't be enslaved. But, you know, there's cases there of where the proclamations were made in a language that people didn't necessarily understand. And this is the bit I really, really wanted to focus on. This is the start of abolition. So this picture here, this is the logo, the campaign logo for abolition that started in the late 1700s. It was designed by Josiah Wedgwood, that should say designed, not devised. And it's a manacled slave on his knees beseeching, am I not a man and a brother? And the belief of the abolitionists was that God is the father of us all, and we as people are brothers and sisters of one another. So on the 22nd of May, 1787, 12 devout men, influenced by Enlightenment ideas and their Christian faith, assembled in a printing shop in London, and they included Granville Sharp, Thomas Clarkson, and William Wilberforce. And they were Quakers and nonconformists, motivated by their faith to bring an end to slavery. So here we have Thomas Clarkson. Thomas Clarkson was a lifelong abolitionist. He strove really, really hard. The documentation says that he traveled 35,000 miles trying to gather evidence of how slaves were treated. He boarded hundreds of ships, got plans of them, interviewed sailors, surgeons, merchants to try and accumulate as much evidence as he could to take to the public, which would then raise this negativity, this public anger, I suppose, towards slavery. So he would also accumulate, what he would do is he would travel around the country with a box, and in that box he'd collected items from slave ships, beautiful items from Africa, including ivory and embroidery and so on and so forth. And he'd argue there against those who would argue about the racial differences and argue about the advanced nature of the African mind. So he'd take this box around with him, increasing awareness of slavery and increasing, I suppose, the public enmity towards it. He visited France. He spoke at the Congress of Verona to try and convince European states to abolish slavery as well. But it's that box he's quite famous for. So here's a few of the abolition acts. So in 1807, the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act was passed. It was banning the trade of slaves, not banning slavery, but banning the buying and selling and transporting of slaves by the British. And some would argue, you know, really it was being broken all the time because ships could not trade in slaves in British waters. So what they do is they stop just short of British waters to trade in slaves. Or what British ships sometimes also did to get past this law was fly the flag of France and Portugal, which didn't have, of Spain and Portugal, which didn't have the same laws. So 1807, that Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, it is said, was quite a weak one. In 1833, Slavery Abolition Act was passed, and this was to abolish slavery in British dominions. Now, bear in mind, that did not include areas that came under the domain of, for example, the East India Company and Ceylon. And the other thing about this act is that although it abolished slavery in British dominions, except for the ones I've just mentioned, it also meant that slaves were now having to work for 6 years as apprentices, and that was unpaid. So for people like Thomas Clarkson, that act just didn't go far enough. They wanted more than that. So in 1838, 5 years later, the apprentice system was abolished. In 1840, British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society was set up, and its president was Thomas Clarkson. We just saw the picture of him. And in 1838 was what many of you probably know about already, where landowners were losing unpaid labor, so they were compensated with 20 million. So note it was the landowners, the slave holders who got 20 million in compensation. In today's money, that's 1,220 million pounds. It wasn't the slaves that got that money to restart. The Royal Navy set up the West Africa Squadron to patrol the seas and suppress the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, so this is William Wilberforce, who's very, very famous. And I suppose he was the mouthpiece of the abolition movement in that he was a politician and he was the voice of the abolition movement in Parliament. So you can see here where different skills came to play. I talked about the act that was passed in 1833 to ban slavery in British Dominion. He died actually 3 days after that act was passed. It is said that a messenger rode very fast on his horse to try and get him the news before he passed away. Granville Sharp, there's a picture of him, civil servant and political reformer. So he said that slavery is not just cruel because slaves are treated badly, but it's cruel because it's morally wrong. It's morally and ethically wrong. Granville Sharp one day found a man called Jonathan Strong, a black slave who'd run away, beaten up on the streets of London. He took him to St. Bart's Hospital at his own expense, paid for his treatment. Jonathan Strong was then captured again by slave captors and put on a ship to be exported, sent back to Jamaica to be sold as a slave. And Granville Sharp actually took this to the Lord Mayor and got him freed. And he fought many cases like this. In 1772, he fought another case of James Somerset. So James Somerset, again, was brought from Jamaica to England, came to England with his owner. He escaped. He ran away. He was recaptured and put on a ship to be taken back to Jamaica and sold as a slave. But Granville Sharp took this case to Lord Mansfield, and Lord Mansfield passed a rule that a slave cannot be forcibly sent to another country. Of course, this didn't end slavery, but it did raise public opinion again. It really, these kind of cases really galvanized public opinion against slavery. He died in 1813. And this is, if you've watched the film, Belle, you'll know about the Zong massacre. So the Zong was a ship owned by a company in Liverpool, a British slave ship that left Africa in September 1781. It had 470 slaves on board, and some started to get sick. So what the crew did was they threw 132 sick and dying slaves overboard. 10 threw themselves overboard. And in their minds, they felt that they would be able to claim make an insurance claim for lost cargo. So when they arrived in Jamaica, they tried to claim for lost cargo, but this was disputed by the insurance company, who said, actually, on your inventory, you said you threw them overboard because you didn't have enough fresh water for the crew and the slaves. Actually, you had 420 gallons of water present. So Granville Sharp helped take this case to Lord Mansfield, and the insurance company did not have to pay. It didn't do much more really in terms of slavery. It didn't declare slavery to be wrong. It didn't free slaves, this act, but it did raise, again, public opinion against slavery. And in the bottom picture, you'll see there Dido Elizabeth Bell, who was a great niece to Lord Mansfield, who took that case up. The case prohibiting insurance companies to claim for murdered slaves. Okay, so we hear a lot about white abolitionists. We don't hear enough about Black abolitionists, and I think we should know their names. As a group, they're often referred to as the Sons of Africa. This is Ignatius Sancho. He was a composer, an actor, and a writer. He was born on a slave ship, and that really gets you thinking, like, you know, we know what the slave ships were like. We know how crowded they were. We've read about it. It's unimaginable. But just imagine giving birth on a slave ship. It just takes it to a different level. And he was born on a slave ship, spent the first 2 years as a slave in Grenada, then brought to England, learned to read and write. And he was the first Black person to vote in parliamentary elections in Britain. Now, after he died, his letters about slavery, describing the horrors of slavery, were published in a book which became a bestseller after his death, and really, really fueled the anti-slavery movement. So these are the words of people that can describe it firsthand. Here we have another son of Africa, Olaudah Equiano. He was enslaved as a child and taken to Virginia. He was brought to England aged 12. Again, he learned to read and write. He bought his own freedom and worked as a seaman and as a captain. He wrote a best-selling book, again, speaking out against slavery. And with his friend Kwabena Kugano, they traveled all over Britain, speaking out and campaigning against slavery. Women's groups, now women themselves didn't have the vote at that time. However, they campaigned, they organized powerful sugar boycotts, because most of the sugar here came from, I'm just doing a time check. Okay, most of the sugar came from from the work of slaves, off the backs of slaves. So they boycott the sugar, write and petition. And this is Anne Knight, a Quaker. She started off the Chelmsford Anti-Slavery Society and lectured on the immorality of slavery. And here we have Hannah More, poet and writer, friend of William Wilberforce. And she helped give the abolition movement a voice through her writings and her poetry. One of her poems, called Slavery, is about a mistreated female slave who was separated from her children, and she writes about her experience. I'm going to finish. I think those are really, really fascinating stories. I've tried to touch a little bit on earlier on when I talked about the overlap between slavery and colonization. We see that later on as well. An argument against the abolition of slavery was that actually we were abolishing slavery on the one hand, yet we had all that was going on in the East India Company on the other. And Shashi Tharoor writes about this, and he writes about how so many Indians were sent to Africa on the proviso that they would be brought back to India after a certain number of years. They were left there literally like indentured laborers or slaves. And the whole process of colonization really kind of like maybe was a smokescreen, but I think Rizwan's going to talk about that later. What I'd like to finish on is just give you a quick snapshot of France and the abolition, just because I think we've heard so much about Toussaint Louverture, so I just wanted to touch on that. So the Friends of Blacks, Les Amis des Noirs, was established in the late 1700s, and it lobbied against the slave trade and to give free Black and biracial people in the colonies equal rights. So we really need to look at Haiti here, which in those days was called the French Saint-Domingue. So most slaves there were transported there by France, and they were supposed to have endured the most barbaric, the harshest of slave systems, the slaves in Haiti. They produced 40% of the sugar and 60% of the coffee that was imported to Europe. So you can see how just one side of an island produced so much sugar and coffee for Europe. Now, with the French Revolution going on and the brutality that these slaves endured in what's now called Haiti, it really fueled a revolution there. And that is the only instance we have of slaves and free people of color winning freedom and creating an independent state by revolt from 1791 and 1804. And this is where we see the character Toussaint Louverture leading, a former slave leading the rebellion. They did overthrow slavery. The problem is that Napoleon Bonaparte came in and he restored slavery. So France had this mixed history with slavery. They finally banned slavery in 1817. In 1817, and then there was a trade in slaves in 1817, and they banned slavery, abolished slavery in 1848. And my final slide, I think I'm on time, is just a little timeline there, which you can look at, and then I'll pass it over to Rizwan. So I hope you found that interesting.
Thank you, Sara, for that. Fascinating story. Oh, jumble of stories, so many to go through, and I think, you know, this is also going to be lots of stories. We're just trying to cover, you know, centuries of history. So what I'm talking about now is the question of how did the Muslim world come to a state of ending slavery. So there was always a reservation about the quality of the way in which slaves had been treated by scholars. Okay, scholars were not happy very often in the way that slaves were treated. And Professor Clarence Smith, who's written about the abolition of slavery, here's the book, it's a good book, do read if you're interested, as well as obviously Jonathan Brown's epic masterpiece as well. So he mentions that scholars over the years had quite a lot of influence on trying to kind of pressure Muslim governments to behave, essentially. Okay, they didn't go so far as banning trade, which is really what could have helped, but certainly try to rein in governments to bring them more in line with at least the teachings of the kind of inherited body of Sharia law. So, for instance, you know, they constantly spoke about eunuchs and about the problems of having eunuchs. One Khalif al-Amin tried to have a eunuch army, which reminds you of Game of Thrones, doesn't it? But the scholars quite quickly spoke out against that and tried to shut that down. They were generally unhappy about slaves being part of the military. We know that, you know, there was a whole kind of industry of that when it came to the Mamluk dynasty, and also in the Ottomans, the Devshirme system, etc. But yeah, you can see here there's a list. There's notes as well. You can go through the notes, which will talk about how they influence changes. So here we have an example of military slaves. Scholars were not happy about slaves being in the military because there's the one concern, obviously, is that, you know, if you've got unfree people in the military, they're likely to be used as cannon fodder. Okay, so it's fundamentally wrong. There's also the idea that if you're fighting for the defense of your country, maybe it's allowed, but if you're fighting an offensive war, then that should be done by free Muslims who are doing it willingly, and seeing it as a kind of religious duty. That was the kind of argument that the scholars were making. So you had, you know, some scholars saying that it was completely disallowed, and other scholars saying that in defense you could have slaves, but not in an offensive war. Then harems or whatever, harams. So these were, you know, a real problem in the kind of circles of the elite, and particularly the kings themselves. So Harun al-Rashid is known to have had hundreds of concubines. Khalifa al-Mutawakkil, 4,000 concubines. Abdul Rahman III of Spain, 6,000. And so on, you know, which was a gross excess, obviously. The Ottomans also had a very peculiar system when it came to concubinage, where they only allowed each concubine to give the caliph, the sultan, one male child, one male heir. So if once one male heir had been born, they were then secluded and taken away from the company of the caliph, and essentially had to live a life of celibacy. Similarly, all the concubines that weren't going to be of any interest to the caliph were forced, as well as their maid slaves, into a life of celibacy, which, of course, is not fair on the kind of rights to a family life that anyone has. So because of that, as you see here from Clarence Smith, he says the ulama favored seclusion of women, but they could not approve of the excessive development of the harem system, which was seriously alien to the Shari'i sense of human dignity. So there was a constant sort of gentle pressure from the scholars against this sort of thing. Now, if we look at actually what happened in terms of the impact of the pressure from scholars in Muslim countries. So you have, for instance, with the gunpowder empires, if we look at the Ottoman Caliphate, the devshirme system, which we spoke about a few weeks ago, where basically non-Muslims were kind of harvested and brought into the military establishment, and also into the administration as well. So they were, this was kind of spoken out against. I ought to mention actually that scholars also spoke out against having slaves as part of the administration, because if you think about it, if your entire administration is going to be made of slaves, you're basically surrounding yourself by yes men. Does that sound familiar? And of course, then that weakens the government, because you're not getting some independent advice to the ruler, and he's essentially ruling and just carrying out his whims, which obviously can sometimes be catastrophic, as we have seen in recent months. So yeah, that was spoken out against. So the devshirme system actually came to an end, and well before any influence from the Western world. Well, there may have been some influence, but not quite to the degree that came later on. And certainly by about 1738, the devshirme system had finished. In Mughal India, which was certainly very powerful and independent at the time, Akbar freed thousands of slaves. His interest was to keep his Hindu subjects happy, and of course, there's a lot of enslavement of Hindus at the time, and he forbade the enslavement of women and children in war. Then later, his descendants were very kind of passionate about trying to end the whole process of castration. And then we have a couple of examples in West Africa where movements were led by scholars, and Futa Toro and the Futa Jalon, who basically tried to reduce the excesses of the slave trade. And they were also very keen to free slaves as well, but particularly if they were Muslim or they'd become Muslim. And the Futa Jalon would just free people if they pronounced the Shahada. The Sokoto Caliphate, which was around in the early 19th century, set up by Uthman Dan Fodio, he launched a jihad and took over a large portion of what is now northern Nigeria and beyond, as you can see on the map here. And he was very keen to follow a kind of Shari'i principled treatment of slaves. So being magnanimous towards slaves, encouraging the freedom of slaves, limiting enslavement as well, to the point that he manumitted his slaves, but they didn't want to leave. They actually preferred to stay with him. And so on also with his descendants. Now the most kind of like interesting and dramatic abolition kind of actions were conducted by Ahmed Bey. So in Tunisia, for centuries, the Ottoman Caliphate had a kind of supposed rule over North Africa, including Tunisia, but actually these places had become autonomous, basically. So they had less. There was almost like a kind of the Ottomans were like a figurehead, and there was an Ottoman establishment locally, but actually these places were very autonomous. So Ahmed Bey, and Bey itself is kind of like, Turkish title, was part of a family of rulers of Tunisia. So, it's basically like a monarchy. And when his father passed away and was and the funeral procession was being conducted, what was traditional at the time was to free a whole ton of slaves and have them march in the procession, in the funeral procession. But Ahmed Bey was the first one to refuse to do this. And he argued that manumission is an act dedicated to God, and it's not done for glory, essentially, which is beautiful. And then soon afterwards, he was really passionate about ending slavery. So soon afterwards, he banned the foreign trade in slaves. And you'll have seen also from what Sara presented that the first thing that comes is the banning of the trade. So you're trying to slowly turn the tap off, essentially. Yeah, and then you finally end up banning slavery itself. So he banned the trade in slaves, and then after that, he banned the enslavement of people that were born to slaves, closed the markets, freed his own slaves, and refused to send slaves as tributes. So they were supposed to be sending tributes regularly to Istanbul, and the tributes would include slaves, and he ended that. And then in 1846, he actually abolished slavery outright. He said that any slave who wants to be free could be free. Dramatic. Now the question is, why did he do that? Because this had never been done before in any Muslim. There'd been some disquiet, as we've seen, but no complete abolition of slavery. What happened? And there's a number of factors here. The notes will have all the details, but if I can just summarize, there's a couple of things that there's a lovely quote as well of why he wanted to do it. I ought to probably mention this one. So, there is, of course, sincerity there, but I think there's a number of factors that also played into it, including the kind of external political factors, shall we say, and Europe was a key factor amongst that. So anyway, in his own words, he said, and avoiding what is permitted out of fear of falling into the realm of the forbidden is part of the sacred law. So what he was arguing is that the slave trade is abominable and results in huge injustices and cruelty. And so that is not permitted. And so therefore, I'll have to limit, even though slavery is permitted by the law, I'm going to limit it because of the excesses that are doing in the name of that. Yeah. So, right, factors that were involved. Oh yes, it's worth saying that the Hanafi and Maliki scholars of Tunisia then agreed with him and said that this is a good thing that you're doing, okay? Although before, that wasn't the kind of thing that scholars would have done. Right, so two things to mention that are just personal factors. One is that his mother had been a Sardinian slave, so he may have had a general unease about slavery from that. Also, he actually quite liked going to Paris and being welcomed as a sort of, an abolitionist hero by the liberal elite of Paris. So there could have been something of wanting to kind of, because he was certainly trying to modernize his army, his society as well, and seeing some of the examples of what was going on in Europe. Okay. Another factor, an external factor, is that the Ottomans were trying to reassert their authority over North Africa. So they'd taken more direct control of Libya, which is a neighbor of Tunisia, and he thought that Tunisia may be next. Now, in order to avoid that, he did something that would ingratiate the British, who could then support him if the Ottomans tried to take more, exert more control. So here we have a little map of the territory. There's Tunisia in the middle here, sandwiched between Algeria and Libya. And just across the waters is France, and over here is Turkey. So Turkey had reasserted its control of Libya. As you can see, Tunisia could have been next, right? But also, let us not forget that in 1846, he banned slavery. In 1830, the French, remember the Corsairs from the North African coast had been constantly raiding southern Europe, Okay, they'd been a bane in the lives of Southerners, to the point that the east coast of Spain had become uninhabited for over a century for that reason. People had just left the coast. Okay, so France had taken Algeria, it had taken Algiers, and then it was working its way inland in 1830. Right, so just before Ahmed Bey became the ruler of Tunisia. So he was noticing that France has, and the reason they did it is to end the Corsair trade. So to end slavery of Frenchmen and Europeans, they took Algeria. So you could see that there was a motive there also. And so if he ended slavery, Britain had already ended slavery, he would be in Britain's good books, and Britain could support him against the French and the Turks on the other side. Do you see how the kind of complexity of what's going on in the world, and particularly the impact of Europe and its opposition to slavery was affecting the Muslim world? Have a look now at the impact of colonization on the world. So the colors here in dark blue are places that have been taken by France. So France actually colonized Tunisia in the end anyway, despite Ahmed Bey's best efforts. So in 1898, this is a map of 1898, you can see that Britain's got India, it's got Egypt, Sudan, okay, it's got protectorates all across the south of Arabia. It had influence with the Saudis in the center of Saudi Arabia here. And France had this big wedge of Africa, including Algeria and Tunisia. So it's the impact of these two countries that actually resulted in the end of slavery in all the different countries. So we've talked about Tunisia. In Algeria, the French abolished slavery in 1848. They didn't initially. Initially, they were actually very duplicitous when it comes to their claim to end slavery. They came to end slavery of Europeans, but they let the slavery of Africans continue. And the conquest of Algeria was brutal. Between 500 to a million people, 500,000 to a million people of a population of 3 million were slaughtered by the French in their conquest of Algeria. So the Egyptians were independent originally, but there was a lot of influence from Britain, and then eventually became a protectorate, a de facto protectorate in all but name, 1867, but actually protectorate in 1918. And slavery was kind of started to be limited 1854, but by 1895, all kinds of slavery were being banned. In 1923, the Egyptian constitution said that all Egyptians are free. Zanzibar itself, a lot of pressure from Britain over the years, and it became a protectorate in 1890, resulting in an abolition of slavery in 1897. Similarly, Turkey was influenced by lots of countries externally, to the point where in the 1850s, I think it is, Turkey banned the trade in European slaves and Christian slaves, but Muslim slaves could still be owned and traded in Turkey, which is paradoxical, but that just shows the influence of external factors on Turkey. And India, of course, banned slavery quite early on, 1843, and to the point that owning a slave was a crime in 1862, and so on. So Iran and Saudi Arabia were relatively independent, and so you can see that they actually banned slavery much later, right? 1929 Iran and 1962 for Saudi Arabia. So you might think, oh well, it's very nice of these countries, but actually, what you find is that there were motives, there were other motives, and I can't go into this, but you can have a little read of White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, and there's actually a huge amount of double standards. If you look at British rule of India, where there's this idea that everything is being done very nobly, but actually Britain usurped the wealth of India to such an extent that it forced the population into famine after famine, whereas before the country had been so wealthy that even poor villagers had gold that they could use in times of kind of hardship, and, you know, when there was a drought, to buy grain and survive, basically. But now they've been drained of all their resources, so that there are all these famines going on in Britain. Then there was indentured labor, which Sara has talked about already, where basically people were hoodwinked into going far away from home and being treated like slaves, essentially, if you look at indentured labor. And we've got notes, the notes will mention all of that, inshallah, as well. When it comes to the actual abolition of slavery, so we've seen before how, you know, many scholars had said that, you know, you can't abolish slavery. And they'd actually been very strong about abolishing the trade in slaves, actually, because they saw this as an attempt to abolish slavery, which actually it was, really. And they said you can't, because what's been made permissible by God cannot be made unpermissible, right? So that was the default position of scholars. And we've got many examples of that. But then in the 19th century, scholars started to take a different way of looking at things. They started to take on the attitudes that you've seen of Ahmed Bey, where they started to say, well, actually, you know, maslaha, which is public welfare, is the responsibility of the government. And if the government feels that something which is permissible, such as slavery, is not in the public interest, then it can be banned. So there's a series of scholars, and you can see through the notes, there's a series of scholars who basically allowed the prohibition of slavery on that prerogative. There's another argument that actually, so I mean the problem with that argument is that what if you have a situation where you know, some government says, but it's in our interest to have slavery again, right? And this is what ISIS did, after all. Yeah. So there's an argument that Sheikh Yaqoubi has used currently, who said that, well, there's a consensus among scholars that slavery is now banned, it's abolished. So if there's consensus, that's ijma, that's a source of law. And if there's consensus, you have to go with it. But there's always been a query about consensus, because before there's a consensus that you can't ban slavery, right? So consensus doesn't have any kind of moral validity. It's almost like just stating what's actually there. It doesn't actually create a moral imperative as such, right? So there's a brilliant point that's made by Rashid Rida. He talks about the fact that the context has changed. Okay, so there are quotes here. For instance, he says that enslaving one's defeated enemies was the norm in the 7th century. The Quran had allowed slavery because it was simply employing the same tactic that the Muslims' enemies were using against them. And then other scholars like Abu Zahra have also made this point, that the context changed. Now the context is not there anymore. That would have made that necessity permissible. Okay, so now you have treaties, which mean that, you know, your borders are protected. They're protected by international law. The international community will come down heavy against any encroachment of any country's borders. You know, I mean, that's in theory. We know about the kind of complexities of the realities. Okay, but as such, that's the imperative for saying that, you know, the whole reason for setting up those laws has changed. So what you can see here is that Sharia was kind of doing a catch-up, but you know, probably in many ways the most forward-thinking scholar on this issue was Rashid Rida, who was sort of saying, well, look at the context, look at the reasoning for the laws, look at the kind of underlying ethic, and look at how, you know, that's not needed anymore. We should abandon it. So just coming to our conclusion then, I think it's, you know, it's very, we have the notes, have a look at the actual quotes of the scholars as well, and follow the arguments through. But to conclude, what we've seen is that slavery was largely continued because of the demand for cheap labor and exploitation. And we know that actually, you know, quite apart from the law, our spiritual code, which sets our moral standards, is against exploitation. It asks us to end exploitation, end the enslaved. And so our lesson, you know, for our current times should be that, you know, constantly we should be on the lookout for economic exploitation, And very often, remember what happened a lot of the time in the Muslim world was that, the ugly reality of making slaves was outsourced, right? So people, it's all nice and clean. You come to a slave market, we're not asking any questions about how the commodities arrived, but we'll deal in the commodity. Do you see the parallels with today? And so, we have to ask ourselves these questions. They're difficult questions that affect us, about things like cotton itself, but so many other things. There's also oppression and enslavement going on in our own homes. Domestic violence and domestic abuse is a form of enslavement. So we need to look at all these, and let's be inspired by the ethic of the Quran to free, to work towards freedom, to look at the oppressed people and see how we can help them in our own countries and also abroad as well. The tension between ethics and law, hopefully it's become clear through this presentation and previous presentations that traditional Islamic law and the scholars that embody it have been constrained, and they always are. They've been constrained by precedent. So if scholars haven't done something before, they're reluctant to do it now. We see that. They've been constrained by culture and the norms. They've been constrained by governments, and also they've been driven by governmental policy. So when governments do things, then they often react to it and have a decision: do we endorse it or do we oppose it? And usually they endorse it. Do you see? So you can't, the problem that Muslims have had is that very often they've set their moral standards to the law. And the law was always there just for when things go badly wrong. When they go really wrong, you can resort to the law for protection. That's all it was for. So you can see that the law actually enshrined different, and this is traditionally, different rights for different people. Different rights for non-Muslims, different rights for men, different rights for women, different rights for unfree people as well, slaves. Yeah. And that's not the ethic of the Quran. We know that the Prophet told us that the son of Adam are equal like the teeth of a comb. We know that any human being, male, female, of actually not even Muslim, can end up in the highest paradise, right? That's all possible in the sight of Allah. In the sight of Allah, we are all eternal beings who have the possibility of living by the light of divine guidance. If we live by that light, we're dear to Allah, and that's as simple as that. So the law doesn't always reflect the equality and the dignity of individual human beings. And this is something that, as a conclusion, I would like to say is that let us all treat each other with that dignity and that morality that we have been inspired by through the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and not rely on necessarily any distinctions that are made between individual human beings on the basis of the law. Okay, I think that will end the discussion for today. Hand back to Alex. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much. So we've had one question, and I know we've run over time, so if I can get a very speedy answer from you. So this is one that you answered before in the talk, but I think it definitely bears repeating. And just to summarize the question, the person is asking that they find it surprising that Islam did not explicitly ban slavery, but did explicitly ban things like adultery and alcohol. And so would you mind just repeating again that answer that you gave as to why slavery wasn't explicitly banned as those things were?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, you're right. This question is asked again a number of times, and I think I've alluded to it before, but just to clarify. So a number of points that we've made already, that the Prophet, if we talk about enslavement, there's two elements, remember. One is enslavement, which is like the trade, you might say, and the other is having slaves. Once they've been enslaved, having them. So enslavement was essentially banned, and this is what Rashida Rida is saying. And so look at the notes for the evidence there. But it's essentially banned by Islam because all the other routes for slavery were closed. The only way you could enslave is as a captive of war, and the Prophet says set the precedent that should only occur as a necessity. It wasn't to ingratiate the troops. It wasn't to reward them for having fought in the battle. It was only as a necessity. And when the Prophet did that, at times he would still just free them. Like Banu Mustalib came back afterwards and they said, well, we're Muslim now, can we just have our wives and children back? And the Prophet asked all the companions, hand them back, let them go. So enslavement was forbidden, except in necessity. And then when it came to owning slaves, it's clear that Islam didn't want people to have slaves. If you're not sure about that, what's Islam saying about slaves? It's saying free them. So that the ethic is there. The law could not, and that's simply because the whole economy, as I've mentioned, was so dependent on slaves that it was just not possible to suddenly end slavery. And we've seen examples, as I mentioned, verses, there's other hadith as well, where the Prophet wanted to do things, but he couldn't always do them because he was constrained by circumstance. So that's, I think that's the answer, Rita.
Thank you. Yes, that's a great answer. I think related to that, what I always think about whenever people ask about Islam and slavery is that surely Malcolm X wouldn't have joined a religion that advocated for slavery. So thank you very much for this talk today. It's been really